When we talked about risk analysis, there were certain things that we could do to take risks from becoming issues. There are things that we could control. We could actually do things differently such that it would either eliminate or mitigate the risks that we might experience. Now, there are certain things, though, that we will have absolutely no control over, whether it is macroeconomic events like inflation rates or other economic activity. Weather is certainly things that we cannot control. The actions of others outside of a certain range we can't control either. So what we do in those cases where we can't control things, what we need to do is create a hedge. We need to create some resiliency within our business case to account for the range of possible outcomes that may occur that we don't have any control over. To explain that a little bit more, think of it in this terms. When you are talking about your costs and benefits, there are certain costs, let's say, that you know what they're going to be precisely. And they're going to vary within a small range between a best case and a worst case. And that typically refers to things that where you get prices from vendors, or you know that certain license fees cost a certain amount. Things that you know with certainty, or within a very narrow range of certainty, what something might cost or what that benefit might be. Then there are other things in your business case which the range of possible outcomes is much wider. You may not know exactly what might happen, and this manifests itself in benefits, where you're trying to determine the quantity is sold. You do your most likely case. You really won't know until you actually get there in terms of what you might actually experience, and it might vary across a wide range of possible outcomes. And this is where sensitivity analysis comes in. So the whole point of sensitivity analysis is to take that uncertainty in whatever parameter that you're looking at, whether it's the price that will drive the quantity demanded on your supply and demand curve, or if it's the number of hours required for the development portion of your project that you don't really know how many development hours it's going to take to create that software. You take that uncertainty, you bake that into your analysis in order to create a hedge so that you simply don't have your most likely case as the only thing that you rely on. Because what we do know is while that might be most likely, there's a good chance that it could be wrong, and it certainly won't reflect the full range of possible outcomes. And what we want to do is we want to come up with a single return on investment that encapsulates the entire range of possible outcomes, and that's what we do with sensitivity analysis. And so how we do that is we do some scenario analysis. We take a look at our most likely case. In fact, that's where we start. And then what we can do is develop cases that get progressively worse or progressively better from that most likely case, and assign probabilities to each one of those cases, and from there we calculate an expected value. And that expected value is an incredibly important number. What an expected value represents is the full range of possible outcomes in a single number, whether that single number is your return on investment, your net present value, or your payback. And we'll walk through how that gets calculated here in a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on three scenarios. We're going to focus on the most likely case, and then the extremes on either end, which is your best case from the most optimistic side, and the worst case, which is your most pessimistic side. So let's start with a discussion of the most likely case. The most likely case is a reasonable yet conservative view of price, quantity, and your costs, and your most likely case has the highest probability of occurring, and that should be your starting point. We'll begin with the initial set of assumptions that you started with. And from there, what we'll do is we will then create a best case, which is an optimistic view of price, quantity, and costs. What's the best that could happen? Then what we will do is take a look at the worst case, which is the pessimistic view of price, quantity, and costs. And the beauty is that spreadsheets makes this so easy to create these various scenarios. What spreadsheets do allow is the other intermediate scenarios that were shown on that diagram in the previous page. And you may want to do that if you want to get a further refinement of all the possible outcomes. But for the most part, a most likely case, best case, and worst case approach will be more than enough to actually do the kind of sensitivity analysis we need to do. But one of the most difficult things, though, is coming up with a probability. So we have to assign a probability to each of those three cases, or to all of the cases if we use more than just simply the most likely, the best case, and the worst case. Here's one thing that I would caution you on. The way the real world works is the probabilities of things going wrong seem to far outweigh the probability of things going well. So unfortunately, the pessimistic view should be given normally greater weight or higher probability than the more optimistic scenarios. So keep that in mind as you think about probabilities. But one of the things that most people struggle with in sensitivity analysis is coming up with what the probabilities might be. And there's many ways to get at those. One is the historical record. If you are in an organization that keeps good records in terms of how long things take or how much things cost or what the experience is with consumer responses to prices that you set for similar products, then you can use the historical record as a means to gauge and probability and even calculate probability. Another approach is to ask experts. There's an old saying that how do you know if you're speaking to an engineer? If you ask them a question and if they begin with the words, "it depends." Well, when you get the "it depends" part, what you need to do is drill in and say, what does it depend upon? And then for each of those dependencies, ask what the probability is of those dependencies. And it really takes a long conversation with an expert to get to what the various probabilities may be. And you're relying on that person's collective knowledge and experience to come up with probabilities. Another approach is the wisdom of the crowd. And while this may seem like guessing, and in fact may be an educated guess, if you ask a reasonable number of people, let's say anywhere from 4 to 7, and get their opinions on things like probability, it's likely that you would do better with the, quote, wisdom of the crowd than you would do simply going on your own and coming up with what the probabilities are. And there's a certain amount of comfort. We need to be careful about certain biases like groupthink, which we talked about in terms of the barriers of good decision making earlier in this module. The other is to benchmark, to go out and look what other organizations do and see what published studies have with respect to likely outcomes of certain things, as well as to compare with similar products or similar strategic initiatives that other organizations may have initiated and rolled out, and to see what their experiences are and to gauge and develop probabilities from simply doing some research and benchmarking on similar organizations. And then the other thing to do, particularly when you're really uncertain, is you could do a pilot project. And a pilot project would then give you some information on how long things would take or what customers' responses might be, those sorts of things. Here again, we want to beware of the past is prologue, because over time certain situations may change and you may have to make sure that you track the conditions that occurred during your pilot project. Are they the same when you go to a full market launch? Those are a number of different ways that you can get at the probabilities of your various scenarios. How do you come up with this thing called the expected value? Well, you begin by calculating the net present value, the ROI, and payback for each one of those scenarios, whether it's the most likely case, the worst case, or the best case. You come up with a net present value, an ROI, and payback for each one of those cases. Then you take the probability and you multiply the net present value, the ROI, and payback by that probability for each scenario. So you come up with what I call the weighted outcome. And then you calculate the expected value by summing the net present value ROI and payback across the various scenarios to determine the expected value for each of those items. So you would add up all the net present value calculations that you came up with in that previous step together, and the sum of those would represent your net present value, expected value. You'd do the same for the ROI. You would do the same for the payback. What we're going to do is we're going to take a break here, but in the next lecture, we'll walk through the mechanics of actually calculating the expected value.